Good afternoon and welcome back. Hope everyone's had a nice lunch break, and a few individuals I think actually went to the bracing spring air outdoors, be fully invigorated. The coffee and other drinks and snacks will remain available throughout the afternoon, so if you feel you need a little sugar rush, just go back and help yourself and come back to your seat. A couple of logistical announcements before starting the afternoon session. First of all, as you know, our proceedings today are being webcast live. But the webcast of the entire day will also be posted on both the SAIS website and the CIC website. So you'll be able to gain access to all or part of it, or have colleagues on campus gain access to it going forward. In addition, almost all of the presenters have promised us written texts, and what we intend to do is to prepare some kind of publication where you'll be able to have access to the exact words in a cleaned up fashion post-event a few weeks from now. We'll send you all an email to let you know when that's available. And finally, before we get started, I want to introduce one individual who's not able to be with us this morning, but who has now joined us, and that's Jim Leach, the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Jim, where are you? Yeah, good. And with that, I will get out of the way and turn the podium over to Jake Schrum. Jake?
Thank you, Rich, and I too am glad to be here today, as I know you are. I work for a fine, small liberal arts college deep in the heart of Texas, and that's not an oxymoron. I, like a lot of you, have been spending a lot of time on the Hill here in Washington, and for me, in Austin, Texas, at the Capitol, visiting with people who we've elected to represent us and to run our state and to run our country. And I've wondered if I am asking the wrong questions when I go to see them. Some of you know that I'm a storyteller, and I'd like to just tell a couple of stories before I introduce our distinguished panel. Sir Kenneth Robinson, in his TED lecture a few years ago on creativity, told the story of a young girl in a fourth grade class who was a behavioral problem. Teacher really did not know what to do with her, and one day, in total frustration, gave everyone in the class a piece of white paper and said, go somewhere in the class and draw something. So this little girl went into a corner of the class, became very quiet and very intent on what she was doing, and the teacher went over to her and said, what are you drawing? And she said, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher, as I think so many teachers do these days, said, well, no one knows what God looks like. And the little girl said, they will in a minute. Now, some of you are more familiar with Joshua Chamberlain. He was an officer in the Union Army at Gettysburg. At that time, when he was recruited to be in the Army, I guess he maybe joined. He was a classics professor at Bowdoin College. He later became president of Bowdoin and governor of Maine. He was told in the very important battle that he was in at Gettysburg that no matter what, he was to hold the line. And as you may know, at Gettysburg, there was a line all the way across a particular hill, and he and his men that he was over were the end of the line, and they were to hold the line. That meant, as many of you know, until every last one of them died, they were not to move from that spot. Well, at one point during the skirmish, he moved his men around behind the Confederates, and they captured many of them, killed many of them, and it was a victory that day. The next day, he was told to hold the line again. He did the same thing. Now, I'm sure his superior officer said, why didn't you hold the line? But maybe the question should have been, what inspired you or possessed you to think that doing what you did was more important than holding the line? So my question is, are we asking the right question? So when I make calls on the Hill, do I need to be the chief education officer for the senator I'm seeing, for the member of the House of Representatives that I'm seeing? Do I need to send a poem that is very meaningful to me about the humanities to that senator or to that representative before I go and see them and have my 10 or 15 minute conversation with them about that piece of poetry or a short essay that I might have sent them? That's really my job. And I'm so busy trying to raise money and to keep the government from doing away with the Pell Grant and keeping the state doing away with the TEG grant that I have forgotten to do my job. And my job is to let the humanities help me inspire the people who are making those decisions. That's what our panelists are going to talk about today. I'm not going to take any more of their time. They're going to talk about the humanities and public policy. And we're going to be led off by Jean Elston, who is a Rockefeller professor at University of Chicago and teaches in the Divinity School. She is going to speak theoretically and lead us off today. And then following her will be the president of Earlham College, Doug Bennett, who actually teaches a course in public policy to undergraduates at Earlham College. He will reflect on how he works with undergraduates to explore issues related to the liberal arts, humanities, and public policy. And then finally, Dana Gioia, who is a poetry professor and essayist at the University of Southern California. He is a past chairman of the Endowment for the Arts. He's a published poet and critic, and he is going to talk about how difficult it is to affect public policy. And so I will let Jean start.
Good afternoon. Let me get these set for a short person. There we go. My thanks to Azar and to Richard and to everyone else responsible for bringing this conference into being. It certainly has been fascinating thus far, and I hope it continues to be. I hope we do our job up here. I'm very honored to have been asked to participate. Now, the humanities and public policy, admittedly, does not fall trippingly off the tongue. In public policy, we think of wonks, and the humanities often, we think of people with their heads in the clouds as they move through the world, not mussing and fussing with the boring particulars of policy making. Now, clearly our panel cannot just leave matters there and pull up its tent and go home. I mean, we could do that, but it wouldn't be very interesting. Clearly there's more to say. So what then is it? And let me begin with a simple observation cast as a query. How often is a conference held to defend the importance, the very existence of law, business, economics, physics, whether to society in general or public policy in particular? I can't think of a single occasion, but certainly it's rare. But events such as ours are a predictable feature of the cultural landscape. Those of us who believe in the vital importance of the humanities, for whom the humanities lie at the heart of things, most often find ourselves on the defensive. That may explain why so many defenses of the humanities begin in brave, bold letters that rather quickly fade like vanishing ink. We don't quite know how to make the case for the humanities to the uncomprehending, nor to defend the humanities against the irate. To the uncomprehending, our case may take the form of glowing, positive assertions. Those who do not know their history are condemned to relive it. The founding fathers were humanists and they did something right. The humanities is foundational to the culture of the West, a claim often burnished with quotes from famous persons. Now, this may all be true, but it is cast at such a level of generality that it isn't too helpful. And we do start to sound like Polonius. Tony Appiah's mention of Polonius this morning put me in mind of that. We may also be tempted to overstate the case. The reader of great works of literature will not become a murderer. the lover of opera could not possibly be deficient in the life of the empathic mind. The aficionado of Mozart will not be cruel and unfeeling. But this is oversimplified, of course, but you take the point. Now, alas, such assertions do not bear up under close scrutiny. Take that lover of opera, Adolf Hitler, who visited the great opera house of Paris as his first task upon making his triumphant entry into the city. He wanted pointers on how to build the grand opera house he had in mind for a new pan-European cultural center in Linz. As well, there are those horrible images from memoirs of death camp survivors, detailing how orchestras composed of prisoners kept alive for the time for that very purpose played classical music, including Mozart, as the damned walked to the gas chambers. And one can name poets and brilliant filmmakers who were fascists or communists, totalitarians, in other words. So it seems that the humanities cannot serve as a universal cleansing agent, scrubbing humanity clean of its propensity toward violence and evil doing. So we say, okay, we won't make that argument. Let's go another direction and try something like arts for art's sake. And I am rather inclined, Azar mentioned about the reason for the sun is the sun. There's something really compelling about that. But we find that sort of argument too narrow and too insular in its aesthetic elitism for a democratic society such as our own. So what recourse do we have then where the uncomprehending are concerned? Let's leave that question hanging and turn to the irate. Those who are unsettled because they cannot see any payoff for monies laid out for the humanities. The humanities, so goes the charge, guarantee no one a job. A lot of parents feel that way, of course, too. But certainly not what many consider a socially necessary job. And in the past several decades, the humanities seem to the irate to have taken leave of their senses. The writing that emerges from many departments of liberal arts is deeply unintelligible and arcane, a dialect favored by those who seem to inhabit a country quite different from the one most citizens call home. So word gets out, and of course it gets sensationalized. Tens of thousands of readers hear that books they love are not in fact what they seem. Books, poems are deconstructed to the vanishing point. The meaning that seemed to inhere in these texts is drained from them. The particularities they cherish, to use Steve Knapp's terms this morning, again seems to be under assault. And as a result, the gap between the academic liberal arts and ordinary citizens grows. And that gap bodes ill when it comes time to look at public policy imperatives and priorities, including support for the humanities. Now, those of us defending the humanities squirm a bit when we deal with situations of this sort, because we sense that there may be something to at least some of the complaints of the irate. So we may acknowledge certain concerns, but we plead moderation and forbearance. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Now here too we appreciate that we need to make a more vigorous case, especially when public policy gets thrown in the bargain. So any line of defense mounted by those declaring, or we recognize this, declaring the relevance of the humanities to public policy will likely be riddled with some pitfalls, especially, it seems to me, if one succumbs to the temptation to make a utilitarian argument, to sort of launch a functionalist manifesto. And many of those recent years work along lines something like this. So it's not the sort of glittering positive generalities. This seems to be more sort of focused and specific. Arguments of this sort. The humanities produce more productive workers. Employers, in fact, like to hire people with humanities backgrounds. This, in turn, helps to keep us competitive. Perhaps not in the direct way that business or economics does, but it functions like that nonetheless. Frustratingly, however, there are no knockdown empirical studies that prove that such claims are verifiable, the sorts of things that would make a public policy person perk up. Now, absent that, it too often sounds as if we are turning what might be a modest benefit into a magnified boon, and it doesn't work. So where are we left? Let's give matters another twist. Let's do something different. Let me share with you a post-9/11 cultural moment. Now, in Chicago, the mayor, Mayor Daley, helped to push through a program, or had already done this prior to 9/11, that generated a citywide reading program. Everyone in the city who was interested would read the same text. It was open to all, available to all citizens, and multiple discussion sections would then be held in public libraries all over the city. Now, 9/11 jolted the planners, and they decided to do something. They selected W.H. Auden's poem 1939 as a public text. And 4 of us, including a poet, were asked to offer brief presentations on the poem. Then things would open up for discussion by the general public. And that discussion was to take place in the largest available auditorium in the downtown library. Now, knowing the size of the venue, I worried in advance that there might be 5 of us on the stage, 4 speakers and a chairwoman, and perhaps 15 or 20 people in the audience. As it turns out, I needn't have worried. The poem, having been made available in the city newspapers, if memory serves, folks trekked in, many just off work, and in their work uniforms, the transit ticket taker, the policeman, the nurse, mothers with children, an interracial audience wanting to discuss a poem occasioned by a public event, the German blitzkrieg against Poland, in order to come to grips with another horrendous public event, the terrorist attacks against America. And I was impressed, as I always am on these occasions, by the insights and the thoughtfulness of ordinary people when they're given an opportunity of this sort. Now, does this connect the humanities and public policy? I think it does, if we are working with a capacious vision of public policy as those activities that involve the public or representatives of the public, all policies, events, and efforts aimed at that public. Now, I know there are many publics, and we can't speak of one uniform public, but let's just leave that aside for the moment. Suffice to say that there is more to public policy than how a bill becomes a law or explicit statutes passed by Congress. Now, before we proceed further, let me note that public policy, not just the humanities, requires critical scrutiny. For many years, the hardcore modelers, with their macro or microeconomic presuppositions, have dominated public policy assessments. This theme has been struck already today. If you cannot quantify something, it does not exist. But there's another step we need to take if we're really going to get to the bottom of this. In efforts of this sort, people are construed in reductionistic terms as maximizers of their marginal utilities. You may not have known that's what you are, but that's what you are. And this vision of human nature or anthropology is, we know this, false to the kinds of creatures we are if it is taken as the whole truth about us, about what motivates us. We know that's not the case. We are also people who dream dreams, who hope, who act out of generosity and kindness with no expectation of reward. We are people who sacrifice for others, who extend ourselves to strangers. There is so much about us and what we are that falls through the grid of the working assumptions of public policy nowadays. Let me give you, just apart from the text here for a moment, an example, one very concrete, direct example of consequences, in this case for foreign policy, of these reductionistic assumptions, and that is the refusal for years in public policy circles and certainly in the academic study of international relations, and there are many influential academics in IR and foreign policy who have a great influence on policymakers in Washington, a refusal to credit religious belief as an independent motivator for people's actions. The argument was that it's always reducible to something else. Now we've learned that that's not the case. But for years, it was assumed that religion meant something else, really. Something else was going on. And as a result, we became terribly short-sighted about events in many parts of the world. So that's one concrete example of this impoverished understanding of the human person. Now, there's something else that's going on with us that isn't touched by this reductionistic understanding of the person. That's something else, that more truthful and enlarged view of the human person and human possibility is nurtured by the humanities. So one thing the humanities has to do with public policy, then, is to challenge its presuppositions at base, to take apart models that have become de rigueur in policy circles. And this is invaluable lest we lose sight of the human being in all his and her complexity and correlatively of citizens in their civic capacities more generally, more specifically, I should say. Now, when we are claimed by citizenship or called to citizenship, it is not in the language of maximizing our marginal utilities, the kind of language favored by the modelers and the policy wonks. We are called to citizenship given our hopes for a fairer and freer and more just and decent world. Now, I find many students of political science, the field in which I earned my PhD, disillusioned by their studies. They enter college aflame with bright ideals, and then they're told what the rock bottom of everything political is, and that the ideals they so cherish are just window dressing to cover up the hardcore stuff that really lies beneath. And they ask themselves, is that all there is then? And the answer surely is, no, it is not by a long shot. And that not by a long shot, again, is the bailiwick of the humanities as our medieval forebears thought of things, humana civilitas, a universal human culture and civilization, truths that can be known by all without distinction, not through revelation but through reason. This was the view of the great church fathers, Augustine and Aquinas. To be sure, revelation opens up vistas otherwise closed. Here we have Augustine's famous credo ut intelligam, or faith-seeking understanding, but there is a natural reason, so went the argument, with which all of God's creatures are gifted. And there is a kind of natural sympathy and basic morality that can be assumed and can be built on. And this helps to hold us together in the city, the earthly city, in which our deepest beliefs may in fact differ. Now, the implications of a liberal arts education for national and foreign policies and policymakers are, as it turns out, of the most fundamental and basic kind. And if we start to look at the world beyond our shores, we are compelled to ask ourselves, is that world nothing but a series of states as uber individuals looking out for their narrowly construed interests? It's called rent-seeking in the world of international relations. Or is there a sense of an international society, perhaps? Not one world. What could be more boring or menacing than a bloated image of a homogenized world with concentrations of power that would involve, but rather a society that has a stake in maintaining a world of many peoples with their own languages and cultures and histories, whose autonomy is made possible by the system in which they are nestled, that preserves and protects their independence. Do we think of others exclusively as adversaries, whether actual or in situ? And that, again, is a reigning presupposition when we get to foreign policy, which was one of the many things we were asked to say something about. Or are they fellow citizens who love their polities as we love ours? Are their ways completely unintelligible to us? Or can we understand through shared reason and imaginative empathy what is going on with other societies, even as they strive to comprehend us? Now, I am not painting some utopian picture here. I'm talking about a living, working reality. But it only works to the extent that the component parts are robust, only when certain understandings and possibilities are kept alive in order to challenge, kept alive in order to shape, kept alive in order to inform. Now, perhaps the best way that I can begin to bring these preliminary remarks to a culmination is to recount another experience. And I would ask you to imagine a time long ago and far away, before measurement mania took over. It's about my own education. I was educated in a school building that housed grades 1 through 12 in this one building in the rural Colorado village of Timnath, Colorado, population 185. The Timnath Consolidated School District number 62 was tucked away in one of those little places in America that had no library. We got books from a bookmobile that drove to Timnath every 2 weeks or so. And our text for high school was called Adventures in Reading. It was published, I think, by Harcourt Brace. Now, I've looked at that text since. By no means was it dominated by a single point of view, not even back in those benighted times. We read, for example, many women writers, Dorothy Canfield Fisher, Elsie Singmaster, Selma Lagerlof, Rosemary Vincent Benet, Willa Cather, Emily Dickinson, the great Indian lyric poet Sarojini Naidu, who was a comrade with Gandhi in the quest for Indian home rule. We read Frederick Douglass. We read Leo Tolstoy. We read translations of Native American warrior songs. Through Adventures in Reading, we were told that we could make the lives and thoughts of others our own in some way. And in my imaginings and yearnings, I did not feel constrained because some of the writers that I admired were men or of another race or from a foreign country. I later chafed against some of the constraints I encountered outside my imagination, of course, but education, at least it's supposed to be this way, is about opening the world up, not imprisoning us in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, or national identity. I was taught, as the preface to the textbook said, reading is your passport to adventure in faraway places. In books, the world lies before you, its paths radiating from great cities to distant lands, to scenes forever new, forever changing. Reading knows no barrier, neither time nor space nor bounds of prejudice. It admits us all into the community of human experience. Now, clearly I was a pretty lucky child. Through an educational policy that at the time lifted up and foregrounded the liberal arts, and those reached all the way to little villages in little spots, white spots on the road, as they were called. In Colorado, we didn't appear on most maps. Reached that far, lifted up, foreground the liberal arts. I was prepared for democratic citizenship and much else besides. Without the liberal arts, the task of human self-understanding, essential to decent and humane public policy, withers on the vine. So the humanities are central to a culture of democratic argument, to building up democratic dispositions. For we need something substantial that we share in order that our differences can be made manifest in a way that distinguishes but does not divide us in insidious ways. Now, taking to heart the humanities gives us a perspective we would otherwise lack on the roiling crises with which we are beset. We can put them into perspective. We need not view them in apocalyptic terms. We've been through something similar, not identical, but similar. We have a repertoire of understandings and concepts we can draw upon to help us deal with the crises of war or the economy and so on. If our conceptual repertoire shrinks, if the well of knowledge dries up, if the very notion of humanities and humanity is forlorn, we may eventually come to look more like the creatures many now build models on. Locked up in boxes of self-interest narrowly construed, rather than self-interest rightly understood, as Alexis de Tocqueville put it, by which he meant a self-interest that is by no means egocentric, but a self-interest tied to an understanding that appreciates that without others, there can really be no self, for we become who we are through dialogue, through the mutual recognition of one and the other, the mutual definition of one another. It takes a bit of effort to make a sustained case, as we've been hearing all day, for the humanities and liberal arts, and the uncomprehending and the irate are people short on time and often temper. But make it we must. We may overuse the word crisis, no doubt we do, but that doesn't mean that we are always wrong to do so. There is a great deal at stake. If Adventures in Reading was right all those many years ago in Little Timnath, Colorado, our self-understanding as persons, as citizens, is up for grabs, and it is something precious. That is something precious that needs conscious tending from the humanities and from public policy, singly and together. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let me add my thanks to Azar and Richard and our good friends at the Carnegie Corporation and at Luce for making this possible. It's wonderful to be among so many friends, past and future. Reflecting on this morning, I just wanted to make an aside, kind of disconnected from most of what I want to say. When the fields of knowledge that we know in the academy were taking shape in the late 19th century, the fields we come to know as political science and sociology and such were not referred to as the social sciences. We've been looking at a big disjunction this morning between the humanities on the one side and the sciences, and those things we call the social sciences have wound up as a sort of huge no man's land in the middle. But they were originally referred to as the new humanities. So maybe we're talking about the resuscitation of the new humanities here, certainly in what Jean had to say, and she and I think are somewhat on the same page. Deep down, I want every student who passes through my hands to read Hobbes's Leviathan, first published in 1651. This is true. I think it's the single best path to a deeper, clearer understanding of politics and the terms of a common life. Hobbes is bracing, very bracing, breathtakingly, and wrestling with Hobbes is an education in clarity all by himself. For those of you who haven't stayed up reading him in the last week, Hobbes is the one who says the condition of man by nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He's the one who argues that the only way to avoid the predicament of the war against all, of all against all, is to have a single, unitary, unquestioned sovereign and to obey him or her or it, no matter how much the sovereign acts in ways that are tyrannical or greedy or brutal or morally bankrupt. I don't want my students to read Hobbes because I agree with Hobbes. I want my students to look deep down into the abyss. I don't believe anyone wholly agrees with Hobbes, and that's the point. But how and why is he wrong? Most of our current political lexicon, most of our ways about thinking about politics today derive from Hobbes. He's the first person to use authority, the way we use the word authority. He's the first to use representation, the way we use the word representation. He's the first person really to begin to talk about and understanding God-given individual rights as fundamental to the way we think about politics. We already, all of us, adopt a great deal of the way Hobbes thinks. How then do we separate from the parts we don't like, especially when there is a taut logic to all that he writes that connects those pieces? That's why I want my students to read Hobbes. For many years, I taught political philosophy in a straightforward way, familiar to many in this room. First Plato, then Aristotle, then chronologically on through Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau to John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And for some students it was fine, but for many others it was a kind of hard slog. Plato was not about their world, and that's where we started, and they kind of tuned out right at the very beginning. Hobbes was, or Aristotle was, well, boring. And Hobbes was just dense and offensive. By this point, we were midway through the semester, and they had just thought, this is absolutely the worst thing I have ever had. So I tried Plan B. And Plan B was to teach the course backwards. First, Mill, who they liked, but maybe with a little encouragement could see, lacked some substantial foundation. Then Locke, who was familiar to them, but they could perhaps see a bit inconsistent. And then Hobbes. And maybe they could see, or at least many of them could, that Locke built on Hobbes's foundations, but perhaps they caught a glimmer that Hobbes built better on those foundations than Locke did. I was trying to walk them into a predicament where once they hit Plato and Aristotle, they'd see why Plato and Aristotle might be valuable to them to help rescue them from the Hobbes predicament, from his bracing and offensive conclusions. Maybe they'd read Plato and Aristotle with a little more sympathy. Maybe they'd see that the assumptions that were wholly individualistic and wholly selfish were not the right ways to think about what it meant to be human. Well, that worked for some students, but then I started trying Plan C. I didn't stop teaching political philosophy, but I also started teaching public policy. If I wanted my students to think clearly and wisely about equality, about liberty and rights, about justice, about the legitimate reach of government power, about what laws could and should do, maybe I could teach that better to more students through public policy than through political philosophy. 20 years into Plan C, I'm pretty sure I'm teaching the same thing whether I'm teaching political philosophy or public policy. The deep issues of the humanities are always the same. When people are poor, what should we do for them? Should we give them money or food? Should we give them these things for every day they are poor, or just for a few years? Because really they should provide for themselves, and we'll ruin them if we provide assistance with no time limit? Do we have responsibility to provide a quality education for all young people? If so, how do we exercise that responsibility? Do we extend it through the 6th grade? Through high school? Through college? Notice, of course, how often the word "we" comes up when you start asking those questions. What are we going to do for one another? And who are we anyway? And who are they, the not we? I was still at Temple University when I started Plan C. One year, among the 24 or so students I had in a public policy course were 2 African-American young men, good friends from childhood, who lived in the very rugged, very poor African-American neighborhood of North Philadelphia that surrounds Temple. We were deep into the course. We discussed poverty policy and Social Security, education, and health care, and we were starting into immigration policy. The most important question regarding immigration policy, I said to them, was one virtually never discussed, but one from which everything else it seemed to me, followed, and that is, should we have open borders? If we have open borders, then we don't have to worry about enforcement questions or a border patrol or the rights of undocumented people. Those questions all go away. But if we don't want to allow access to everyone who wants to come in, then we do have to think about those things. And also justify why we are telling some people that they can't have access to what God has provided to us all in common on this planet. So I asked this group of students, do you believe in open borders? No, said one of the two young men firmly, one of these two young African-American men, just as the other, just as firmly, said yes. And then they looked at each other. I don't imagine they'd ever disagreed so starkly about anything. To one, it was intuitively and immediately clear that the United States government has no legitimate authority to exclude anyone who was seeking opportunity. He had seen enough of that himself, and for those like him, his entire life. And to the other, it was equally clear that to allow free entry to anyone and everyone would further delay the already unconscionably long-delayed saga of equality for African Americans, first brought to these United States against their will. I wasn't privileged to hear the rest of that argument. They had an outside class. I'm sure they were better off for having that argument. In honesty, we all ought to have it. Today we're having, I'm sure you all know, a difficult, edgy, often uncivil argument about the future direction of these United States, much of it being waged in public policy terms. Much of it, often the Constitution of the United States gets dragged into this argument. For some, it's a question of whether we respect the Constitution. But I believe it's much better understood as an argument about how we should read the Constitution in respecting it. They've even taken to reading the Constitution in the House of Representatives. We heard these words this morning, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. Those, of course, are the opening words. Those aren't so much the words we argue about, but let's just pause on those first words, we the people. The Constitution doesn't mean very much if we don't know how to say we the people. But how do we manage to say we? Well, don't you know that's Hobbes's problem? Starting with so many glorious individuals, so many selfish, narrowly selfish, egotistical individuals, Hobbes can't see any way to say we without an overbearing government, a sovereign who makes us a we by force and fiat. A sovereign who does just as he or it pleases, representing us by speaking for us and not needing to care a whit what we happen to think. I imagine that each and every one of you believes that it is possible to say we in some way, in some degree of inclusiveness, and with the implication of some degree of moral or civic responsibility to take care of one another, to take care of those within the we. And I imagine that each and every one of us believes that it's possible to constitute that we without an autocrat assembling and ordering the we-ness. Put another way, I imagine that each and every one of you disagrees with Hobbes. I'm talking about Hobbes today in a consideration of humanities and public policy because the study of public policy today is dominated by the methods and perspectives drawn from the discipline of economics. And economics has its footings intellectually, squarely in Hobbes. It is a world composed in the mind of economics of individuals, whether persons or firms, and it assumes those individuals act out of selfishness, or put another way, out of the maximization of utility. The framing questions in which Hobbesian or economistic terms narrows what we can think possible. If you start with Hobbes's assumptions about human beings, it is very difficult to escape his conclusions. Towards the end of his life, the historian Tony Judt made a similar point in a remarkable valedictory lecture entitled "What is Living and What is Dead in Social Democracy?" His topic was the overall character of public policy in advanced industrial countries. For the last 30 years in much of the English-speaking world, though less so in continental Europe and elsewhere, when asking ourselves whether to support a particular proposal or initiative, he said, we have not asked, is it good or bad? Instead, we inquire, is it efficient? Is it productive? Would it benefit gross domestic product? Will it contribute to growth? This propensity to avoid moral considerations, to restrict ourselves to issues of profit and loss, economic questions in the narrowest sense, is not an instinctive human condition. It is an acquired taste. To talk meaningfully about public policy, that's the end of the quote. To talk meaningfully about public policy, you do have to ask whether a policy is good or bad. You do have to address moral questions. Those moral questions get flattened into one shallow dimension of gain or loss for selfish individuals, the perspective of Hobbes, if we let them. Even more than I want my students to read Hobbes, I want them to think deeply about when and whether it is ever possible to think sensibly about a we. It seems easy to say we the people until you start to think about it. Hobbes thought about it and wasn't sure we ever could. Most of us think it must be possible and live trying to make those connections that constitute a we. One way to look at the humanities is to see them as successive, alternative, contested and contesting ways of answering that problem. I want my students to think about who we are, about how we became a we, about who we should exclude from the we. I want them to think about what we owe one another and what responsibilities we have. I want them to think about what we can count on, what we are entitled to, what rights we have, if you will, from one another. And most of all, I want my students to think about why we think about we the people in whatever way we do. Where will we go for the answers? Well, Tony Jutt's answer was, he said about historians, a historian has to be an anthropologist, he said, also has to be a philosopher, also has to be a moralist, also has to understand the economics of the period he is writing about. I think the same can and should be said about public policy persons. I hope my students will read Hobbes, but I also hope they'll read 1,000 other profound works of the humanities. I hope they'll read Faulkner and Rousseau. I hope they'll read the Bible and the Quran. I hope they'll read Elizabeth Bishop and Sojourner Truth. And all the while, I hope they're wondering about whether and how and with what breadth we can say, we, the people. Thanks.
Good afternoon. In such a learned company of people who have seriously pondered the role of the university and the foundations and institutions which support it, I won't venture my opinions on matters my audience knows so much better than I. I feel like a wandering tinker addressing an audience of nuclear physicists. I will only claim that on a few practical matters I have some expertise, namely the role of the federal government, and by extension the state and local governments, in supporting the arts and humanities. And I'm happy today to have two of my, I guess, colleagues in a larger sense, Frank Hodsell, former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, and Jim Leach, the chairman of the NEH, who I also still think of as congressman, Jim Leach of Iowa, who will understand these very well. In my years in Washington, I have observed that most academics have only a vague idea of precisely what is happening in Washington, either in funding or policy. And I really can't blame them because the process is opaque and the outcomes are mercurial. Things are changing all the time. Although subtlety of argument and nuance of phrasing is the favorite idiom in conferences such as this, I'm going to speak in, to quote Randall Jarrell, English that dogs and cats can understand. Mostly because I want to present a few large, ponderable ideas quickly and clearly. I want to say really only 4 things, some of which you probably know, but which you may not have understood in context or in relationship to each other. My main points will be that, first of all, public funding and political support for the arts and humanities is collapsing in the United States at the moment. Secondly, things will get worse in the near future, no matter what party is in charge. 3, the root of this problem is not merely the budget crisis experienced by the federal, state, and local governments, but reflects a collapse of the public and political consensus for supporting the arts and humanities with governmental funds. And finally, 4, the problem can be solved. First, let me tell you what is happening at the moment with federal support for arts and humanities. I'm sure that everyone in the room knows that both the NEH and NEA and IMLS are facing severe budget cuts. At the moment, the 2 numbers on the table for the NEH and the NEA is a minus $22.5 million for each agency. That number will change. I hope it'll be less rather than greater in terms of the cuts. But what is particularly scary is the process by which this current number was achieved. A Democratic White House recommended a $21.5 million cut for each of these agencies, to which the Republicans then added only an additional $1 million, though a faction of Republicans tried to reduce it by $40 million, which luckily was defeated. The IMLS budget has been even larger, around currently $65 million, although that number I think is going to be open to much debate. I'm not mentioning these cuts of the process for any partisan reason, but simply to make a point. There is currently a bipartisan consensus in Washington that the arts and humanities should be cut to protect other political budget priorities. The only debate is by how much the cuts should be, and the differences between the parties now seem relatively small. This is a change in federal policy. This collapse comes after a decade of steady, if not always spectacular, increases under both Democratic and Republican administrations. In other words, these cuts constitute a significant change in public policy towards the arts and humanities in response to other political and economic changes. As I've said, these changes are likely to get worse in the short run. Although the arts and humanities have strong supporters in both parties, in both chambers of Congress, in the White House, they seem to be on no one's A priority list. Now, there are cultural reasons and accounting reasons why the arts and humanities are particularly vulnerable. Let me speak to merely one of the budgetary reasons. They are funded in the discretionary parts of both federal and state budgets, which are often the only areas where cuts can easily be made. So even if they had stronger support, they would nonetheless remain in the most vulnerable category of public spending. And here they compete with social, economic, educational, and environmental programs which have stronger support. Even within education, funding will be focused more on what are seen, rightly or wrongly, more practical, inclusive, and economically beneficial basic skill areas. The arts and humanities in such an environment are seen as attractive but unaffordable, and also economically unproductive and elitist luxuries. Unlike vastly more expensive public instruments such as sports stadiums and assorted brick and mortar projects that are seen or at least positioned as having more tangible political and economic benefits. The reason that the arts and humanities funding is being cut disproportionately and in some states even being eliminated is that there is currently no workable public consensus on why these enterprises are essential to society, why they contribute uniquely to the public good. There really aren't many people, though we would like to imagine that there are, who says the arts are bad, humanities are bad. What we have instead is a public sector which, by and large, does not have a compelling argument why what they think the humanities do, what arts do, is either a kind of minor contribution to society or something that can be done by other things more directly. There are, that is, no compelling arguments understood by leaders in government, business, the media, and the general public on why the arts and humanities are of equal importance to other seemingly more urgent public priorities. I may need to remind you here that this has not always been the case. One does not even need to go back to the 1950s in my home state of California, which provided huge and sustained support to build perhaps the greatest public university system in the history of humanity. One can simply go back to the previous decade when the NEA and NEH created a bipartisan consensus to bring the best of arts and arts education to all Americans. This consensus not only substantially increased federal funding, but by extension it helped increase state and local funding and affected private and corporate support. I will give you one example, the Big Read, which was a program created by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Within 3 years, not only had enormous federal support, making it the largest literary and probably arts campaign in the history of the federal government, but had 25,000 other organizations supporting and funding it. The catalytic role of public funding cannot be overestimated in the arts and humanities. But what's interesting is that as this crisis has unfolded, the humanities have been unable to muster compelling public arguments. Let me mention only Stanley Fish's now notorious letter protesting SUNY Albany's decision to shut its French, Russian, Italian, classics, and theater department. In attacking this egregious public decision, Fish conceded that the humanities doesn't enhance our culture, doesn't contribute to economic health, doesn't contribute to the vitality of the state, and doesn't make society better, but only that the humanities were, quote, a device of employment for me and my fellow humanists, end quote. I'm sure that Professor Fish's remarks contained layers of sophisticated irony and a skilled de haut en bas Olympian rhetoric. But that sophistication is lost on legislators, governors, assemblymen, senators, and public administrators who are making hard decisions about pressing public priorities. With advocates like Fish, we need not fear the Tea Party. Professors have grown so skilled at speaking to one another, they have forgotten how to speak to people outside their own subculture. They also love to parse endlessly arguments, and there is a premium of never bringing a conversation to its conclusion. Professors, in fact, have grown embarrassed by simplicity, as embarrassed as the Puritans were about sex. But I would suggest that both of those things have their purposes. A certain cynical detachment may work in the English department, but it undercuts authority in the public sector. People very rightly don't want a mayor or a judge, a governor or a senator who is ironically detached from the citizens they serve. What we need to foster is something that comes with difficulty to many of our best academic minds, namely to speak clearly and inclusively to constituencies outside the university, which also means listening to and acknowledging their concerns in order to build a meaningful consensus about the larger value of things that we individually and professionally cherish. Building a public consensus does not mean that we have to cheapen or dilute our values. It is not selling out the humanities, but it may involve selling the idea of the value of the humanities to people who do not have the personal experience with them that we have. It also means that we need to entertain values that are often slightly different than our own to find common ground. So now to my final observation. The problem of public support of the arts and humanities can be solved by building such a new consensus about the value and importance they have to our society. The one delicious, though unintended irony of Professor Fish's editorial is that precisely those public claims for the humanities, which he dismisses as pieties, are actually verifiable facts. And here's the only point that I must disagree with your otherwise eloquent defense and testimony of the value of these things. I would say that in documents like the NEA's To Read or Not to Read, we have put together an empirical basis for the public value of the humanities. The interesting thing, and this is interesting to anyone who's ever tried to take several different databases and make them work together, they almost always point in opposite direction. What we have seen is that there is virtual unanimity among dozens of comprehensive and statistically reliable studies conducted by dozens of federal agencies and research universities that the humanities, which is to say, and the arts is embodied, and this is the one that we can measure most carefully because there's over 44 studies on it, literary reading, which is to say humanistic reading for pleasure and enlightenment, changes people. It makes decisive and measurable differences in individuals and communities. It creates more successful students, more successful workers, more engaged citizens, and transforms social involvement and values. Now, these may not be the reasons why any of us devoted our lives to art, to literature, to history, but they are compelling ideas in a nation where 1 out of every 3 teenagers drops out of high school, and with it not only ensures lower economic outcome lower social status, but will, by most measures, live 7 years less. This is not merely a cultural issue, but an issue of economic justice and public health. Or in a culture, in a society where reading skills have dropped to such a level that they are now cited by employers as one of the major impediments to hiring and maintaining workers. This data is so unambiguous, so overwhelming, that it makes clear that practical vocational education is not necessarily either practical or economically productive. Now, humanists hate statistical surveys. One of the reasons I've discovered is that they often don't know how to read them, but I won't go into that today. But we have to acknowledge that when you're entering the public sector, empirical data, statistical data, is of enormous importance. We need collectively to put aside some of the cynicism that exists among us about the political realm, about the business world, the media, and the general public, and to think respectfully about their issues and concerns. If we want to work successfully in a democratic society, we need to work with the components of democracy. And frankly, it's really not so bad. What I discovered is that in every branch of society, you will immediately find people who care about the same things that we do. Even in Congress, even in the corporate world, you find these people quite commonly. Now, many of them want to be engaged in this, but they don't have what they feel are winning arguments or compelling data. The question is, can we offer them what they need so that together we can create the society in which we all want to live? Culture, like politics, is a conversation, an ongoing dialectic. We need to initiate and enliven this dialectic, this public conversation. If we talk only to ourselves, then the conversation will be dominated by the less informed and the less committed, sometimes even by the inimical. Our objective is very simple, namely to convince the public sector in all of its complexity and diversity that the purpose of education is not to produce entry-level workers, but to create complete individuals who are capable of leading productive lives in a complex and changing society. Education needs to address, to awaken, to enlarge, and to enhance the complete human being. We need to educate the emotions and the imagination as well as the intellect. Now, our objective, and this is the thing that you must keep in the forefront of your mind, is not to create a new academic discipline, not to create a compelling new theory of policy. It is to engage the interest and elicit the support of people who have no intrinsic interest in our fields and make them understand the benefits, the real, the considerable, the inarguable benefits of the arts and humanities. Not all of the benefits, not all eternal arguments, but a few relevant, practical ones that at this moment in American politics will affect them powerfully. Simple, compelling ideas. It's really not that hard to do if we can think outside of our own subculture. New coalitions, new consensuses, consensi seems so artificial, doesn't it, are being made all the time when people make common cause to support things of common concern. I would simply like to end by saying it's time to reconnect the humanities to humanity. Because it's easy right now. We have no choice. And who knows? We might even learn something. Thank you so much.
So as a panel, do you want to just talk only to yourselves at this point? or would you like to connect with our colleagues in the audience? Would we? Yes, question?
Just turn, yeah, open it up.
Okay. Question? Yes. Would you tell us your name and where you're from?
Yes, my name is Karen Erickson. I'm from Southern New Hampshire University. I just want to know what those few relevant, compelling ideas are.
I outlined a few of them, I think, in there. You know, really what we have right now in the United States economically, among the other problems, is a crisis, I think, in the national confidence that we're creating an economy that's going to be sustainable for our children and grandchildren. Part of it is the educational outcomes of today's students. Which is we have, for example, the first generation of men that are essentially failing in the educational process. We have, depending on how you measure it, about 30% of current college graduates can't read at proficiency level. We have people who are basically not coming into a job market with the skills that either they need individually or the society needs collectively. Now, there's two theories of how to deal with this. One is to make the education more reductive, more restrictive, more vocationally oriented. The other, in a sense, is to go back to what seems to have been working for the last couple thousand years, which is to allow people, in a sense, to have, pleasure and enlightenment guide them, in a broader sense. You can demonstrate the effect of this statistically. I mean, I would urge all of you to read the studies that the NEA has been publishing over the last couple of years. Contact Sunil Iyengar at the NEA and just read through this material. I mean, it has the correlations between voluntary reading, which is about half the population does, versus non-reading, is so overwhelming. And this is literary reading, which is essentially humanistic reading, that it's hard to muster an argument against it. And I think what this is simply the tip of the iceberg. So I agree with you that we need about 10 times as many studies as we have. But we actually, for the first time in our history, have empirical data which supports the effectiveness of what we're doing, not in terms of producing PhDs in humanities, but producing engaged, active, productive citizens by any measure that you want, be it incarceration levels, income levels, volunteer levels, voting levels. And there's 44 studies that are consistent about this. And so that's what I would do. Now, I know that a lot of you feel really bad that you'd have to argue about the practical side of what you do. Because is there anybody in this room that went into medieval studies for practical reasons? At least practical reasons insofar as your parents would have understood. The English major has never been classics majors. I mean, these things, they've never been practical, except that it's practical to lead a life that gives you joy and meaning. And what you have to do is divorce the reasons why you're doing it from essentially the collective reasons that all of us together and the students that we have and the institutions that we work for create for society at large. And I think that we can demonstrate those now.
Can I add something to this? A couple of things. One is, I'm delighted that there are some robust statistical studies, more than I apparently knew about, out there. But I think it still remains the case, and this would get us into the niceties of some debates about the difference between what I call the sort of hardcore modelers and those who do statistical analysis about what's compelling to whom. But let's just bracket that. I don't think that's terribly important at the moment. But one point that I did want to pick up on that Dana mentioned was the fact that often academics, like many of us, tend to shun we lament where the public policy people are going, where the politicians are going, but we shun them at the same time because there's something about the process that we approach rather cynically. And my encounters with people from Congress over the years, both sides of the aisle, has been that they're, for the most part, pretty well-meaning and hardworking people. And their staffs are pretty well informed and engaged.
Yep.
And I think that it's that those are people to whom certain arguments will be compelling. Now they have to try to sell it to other folks, but I do think there are grounds out there for being hopeful. And one has to sort of overcome this reticence about getting one's hands sort of messy.
No, I agree.
I think it's terribly important.
I mean, in Congress, almost without exception, the members of Congress are trying to do what, by their rights, they think is best for their constituencies. Now, there may be some exceptions. The real issue is that sometimes what they think is best is not what we think is best. And that's where you can engage them in conversation. But one thing I would say is that, remember, we're not trying to take these statistics to convince philosophers. We're trying to use them to convince mayors and governors. And what they're going to be looking at is a couple of salient ideas that seem to them reasonable and have some support. And I think that's actually an easier target.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, in the back.
My name's Lewis Martin, and I'm at Elizabethtown College. I've heard two people talk about really focusing on the pleasure that we get from works of art, from works of literature. And I'm going to suggest that maybe there are two things that we can do to use that to help further the goals that we're all here to discuss. One is for those future mayors, those future congressmen, whoever they are, be sure that they have an art course or a literature course or a history course that really moves them, that they're really excited about. So in ways that we can generate our own enthusiasm and excitement and passion and love and still reach out, not talk the language of the academy so much, but talk to them, listen to them, understand where they are, and really respond to them in discussions in the classroom. And the other thing is to prepare teachers of elementary education who will ignore the pressure to teach the test, who will ignore the pressure to conform to No Child Left Behind mandates and things like that, and who will focus on starting children in the first grade, in the second grade, and the third grade, again finding the pleasure in learning about a historical figure, looking at a work of art, reading a poem, because if they get to high school and they haven't had some enjoyment, you've lost them. So just a couple of suggestions and then comments from people. How many here are teachers of literature or art or history? I'm just curious. Yeah, okay. Well,
if I can just comment on what you said, I'm very much in agreement with that. And I think one of the issues that we're now facing is that we're coming up on the first generation of American politicians and businessmen and civic leaders who did not have arts education as a fundamental part of their own formational experience. When you're dealing with somebody who was in school plays, who played an instrument, who grew up with these things, they immediately get it in an intuitive way. Our challenge is to how do you talk to people about this for whom it is slightly outside their own experiential frame of reference.
Was there a question? Yeah.
May I respond to this one as well? It seems to me also that, given your comments, that this is where, apropos a question that was posed to a previous panel, the popular culture enters in. Because much of the pleasure and enthusiasm for young readers, for example, came from the Harry Potter series. And there has to be a way that teachers can connect with that and not, again, see that as some sort of second-rate kind of activity, because readings of that sort can, and certain kinds of films, television programs children may watch can be a vehicle, to lead them into certain other understandings and insights. So that's where the popular culture dimension enters, and we have to be, I think, aware of that and sensitive to it and figure out how we can make the best use of it.
Sir?
Yeah, my name is Neil Safir. I actually teach history of Europe and Latin America at the University of British Columbia. And I'm here as a representative of a group that is actually trying to institute or consider the possibility of instituting a humanities center at UBC. And being there and being in a place, in a country that actually puts the importance on First Nations history and in a different way than most U.S. institutions do, and also being in an institution where 40% of the students don't speak English as a native language. I wonder if I could sort of bring our attention to one of the questions that is on here that none of you addressed, but I think could possibly be connected, which is how Western are the humanities. A lot of people this morning have talked about the tension between the universal and the particular in the study of the humanities, and I wonder the extent to which the aspirations for a kind of universal set of values that I think many of us think that the humanities have an important role in bringing about actually gets away with talking about the particular situations of the communities that we happen to be serving. I wonder if we can think perhaps about a future of the humanities that is more closely tied to local communities so that the support can actually be more grassroots and perhaps less connected to an abstract set of principles that may be in fact more difficult to sell, to use a loaded word.
It strikes me that there are going to be some real tensions in what you propose or suggest, because as a number have pointed out, Tony did that earlier today and others have, there's a very close connection between the humanities and our notion of humanity. And we can't get away from that when we talk about the humanities, and I don't think we should, not at all. Certain aspirations, as we now have seen quite vividly displayed to us, have become universal. Maybe they weren't at one point, but they are now. One of the great stories of the post-World War II world is the universalization of notions of human rights, for example. It's not just a language that we speak in the West, but it's the language that the aggrieved peoples everywhere speak when they want to make a claim or make a case against those who are tormenting them. So we have to absolutely keep that alive. At the same time, I don't want to simply suggest that your question is something we can just slither past, because it does seem to me that there is a way. It takes some effort, but there is a way that one can look at particular manifestations of humanity, and that can open us up into a more general understanding or view of the humanities as well. We just don't want it to stop there. And as you know, there's a real danger in some evocations of multiculturalism that it just becomes a series of monoculturalisms. And people are offered no way to sort of connect with one another, and we all sort of are inside our little boxes bleating at one another, and the assumption is we can't really make this other connection. The humanities tied to humanity assumes that we can and that we must. And that can't be lost. So if you can devise a way to do that, obviously more power to you. But I think it's a real challenge, because the tendency now, I think much of the pressure is the pressure to kind of hunker down into these particular notions of community, that they're so absolutely unique, that they're not part of this more general understanding of humanity.
Was there a question in the back? Okay, sir, right, I think you're next here, sir.
Hi, I'm Neil Frystad from the University of Maryland. I direct the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities. A lot of what we've heard about the future today has been in terms of the jeopardy that the humanities is facing. There hasn't been a lot about how the humanities are changing and will be changing for the future, and talking about a compelling vision of what we can be, not just what we have been, but what we can be. And I'm wondering, if that would start making a compelling narrative. And part of that narrative is we are digitizing our entire cultural heritage. There's a place for the public in what we do. There's a way to get out our products, our scholarship, to larger audiences more worldwide than ever before. I could go on, but it seems to me there are some pretty compelling points to make. The humanities are becoming more collaborative. They're becoming more interdisciplinary. All those things signify, and they signify in how knowledge is being produced and disseminated in different ways.
Yeah, one thing I think that is important is that when you're making the argument, it should be a happy argument, which is to say that what you're delivering is a benefit that everyone wants to share with. If you just sit there and do gloom and doom, it's not very attractive. And I agree with you about the enormous power of technology. My only worry is that, a light bulb might go on in some accountant's mind saying, well, gee, what if we shut all the universities down and create some websites? And so, there's the notion of taking humans out of the humanities.
Yeah, close the libraries.
Yeah.
Close the libraries.
Yeah, so I agree with you. It's just that I think it's always a balancing act. But I think you're absolutely right that we have to be positive, because if we're not positive, if we don't believe the value, the joy of what it is we're doing, the transformational power of what it is we're doing, why should anybody else believe us? And emotions communicate as strongly as ideas.
Richard started us off this morning by saying we didn't want to talk about the culture wars, but I guess I want to disagree maybe 90 degrees with that thought. One of the things the humanities does for us is make sense of a world, and we're in a world that's changing dramatically quickly, and that's scary to people. We are absorbing a whole wider world. This comes back to your question. We've developed our understanding of the humanities largely without reference to Asia, largely without reference to the Islamic world. One of the things that the humanities is at work on now is trying to understand the possibilities of being human in a much larger kind of way. And that is going to be scary. That is going to frighten people. And we shouldn't try to walk away from that.
I'm right. I was simply talking about it dealing with the public sector.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I don't think you want to scare a mayor too much. I mean, his daily life is scary enough.
Yeah, that's right. I may not be the best person to respond to your question. A few weeks ago, upon the receipt of an award, the American poet and essayist and tobacco farmer, Wendell Berry, talked about starting a society for the preservation of the tangible. And I want to be a member of that, one of the sort of founding members of that society, because there is something about the tangible, about a book that you carry about, and you sort of dog-ear it, and you write in the margins and so forth. So I don't think we should want to take leave of that world too quickly. I mean, we want to acknowledge the world that we've got, and the digitization and the availability issue, because that is a remarkable thing. There's absolutely no doubt about it. What can be made available to people in far-flung places that they never would have had access before. But there's something about human beings. I mean, we are sort of embodied creatures, and there's something about the sort of texture of stuff around us that I think is terribly important. And part of that texture in the humanities has been, again, the world of artifacts, a world of books, a world of paintings, a world of really concrete stuff. And I think we want to preserve that and cherish that, and to make sure that that's always available as well, even as we go these other directions. And I think also, no matter how compelling your vision is of what we can be, it's always going to be tied to what we are at present and what maybe we once were. Dana pointed out that there were ways in which we were educated at one point, and I tried to convey some of that with my story of my own experience, how young people were taught that was quite arguably better, given a whole list of concerns that we have about literacy and democratic citizenship and so on, than what we're doing now. So there are ways that our looking into the future has to also be a task of recuperation, of going back to the past and bringing those bits that are vital and important and that we can and should cherish, bringing those into the future with us. So that's why I'm always a little bit uneasy when people get you didn't do this, but there are some who do. When people get all starry-eyed and and about this new sort of world, that's going to totally supplant the old, and we don't have to worry about this old stuff anymore. I think we do, even as all these other developments take place. And we can't oppose them. It would be like opposing the rising and setting of the sun. I mean, they're going to be happening. The question is to what uses are they put? Who controls them? Who decides how they're going to be deployed, in other words? What role are they going to play in education? And to guarantee, or to try to guarantee, that we not simply see that these new techniques can supplant some of the stuff that went before entirely. I don't think it can.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. We will be taking a 15-minute break.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you, Jean.
Yes, you bet. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dana.
I'd like to talk to you about Hobbs walk-in all sometime. That would be fun. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, thanks. Thank you. I think it went well. The panel really came together. I was so much. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Well, thanks again for inviting me. It was great to be part of it. It's really great. Yes. We're losing it. Yep. Yes. And we lose a sense of, real readers in books in real places, and it's replaced by this notion of, virtual community. We lose the embodied nature of human reality. It's very worrisome. Exactly.
In the program, yes.
Okay.
Whatever you want.
I think we're ready to resume for our fourth and final session of the day. Everyone wants to come in. Can people in the back just bring their coffee or cookies back in? A number of you have asked about the research studies that Dana Joya alluded to. If everyone can come back in, we're ready to start our fourth session. A number of you asked about the research studies that Dana Joya alluded to, and he pointed out that we're not seeing you get the word through at the back, are we? No. Okay. Just keep talking? Okay. Dana says that all these studies are listed on the NEA's website. So if you go to NEA.gov and then select research, you get a list of all the studies and all the publications. I forgot to ask them if they're all available online, but they probably are. Hal, do you know if they're online? Okay. So that's NEA.gov, and then go to research, and you find the list of the studies there. Now to begin our final session, let me call on Dorothy Kaczynski.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I feel like I am the woman representing what in the Academy is referred to as the other art history, as a practitioner, an art historian, a practitioner in the realm of museums. I'm the director of the Phillips Collection, 10-minute walk from here, just on the other side of DuPont Circle. I want to thank Richard and Azar for including me. I'm very happy to be here to represent museums, and I'm speaking essentially of art museums specifically, as powerfully important humanities institutions pursuing object-based learning, art historical scholarship, connoisseurship, and advancing new knowledge through conservation and technical analysis. And I just want to talk a little bit about the Phillips as a setup to the proposed topic of this session of thinking outside of the Academy, of the humanities as a force and a voice and a role in the broader world. The traditional mission statement of any museum a few decades ago ran along the lines of collect, preserve, and interpret works of art. And I would say that the museum in the 21st century does all of that for sure, but much, much more. Museums fill an important role, and I should point out during the last 30 years or so, as we have abandoned the arts in our public school system, we fill an important role of teaching about art, and increasingly assisting the teachers, as I put it, in the trenches, with using art to be more effective in addressing their core subjects. It's not always about making art itself, though sometimes is, but fostering creative problem solving, innovation, and dynamic learning. The museum has evolved as a powerful community forum, crafting partnerships with universities, theaters, dance companies, and music organizations, and a huge variety of community cultural groups. The museum, thereby, embraces a very robust public intellectual persona. Technology has had a hugely transformative impact. Decades ago, there was a good deal of consternation or suspicion of how the virtual experience might undermine the special quality of the encounter with the original work of art and thereby discourage visitorship. Instead, technology, we have learned, allows us to extend the impact of our knowledge through digitization, with online tools, with media-rich experience, and it goes on and on. We can have a more powerful footprint in the world. Social media, from Facebook to Flickr and Twitter to apps, see, I'm unafraid, all allow us to reach out more effectively, to reach new generations, and diverse audiences. And there is generally a demand for transparency and accessibility. All of that, all of these tools are a way to enhance and expand the experience. Corporate leaders, even the Department of Education, IMLS, and NEH, today frame the essential skills needed in the 21st century as creativity, innovation, visual literacy, critical thinking, problem solving, communication, and collaboration. I see a perfect alignment with the characteristics of the museum in the 21st century. Now, the Phillips Collection, celebrating our 90th anniversary this year. It's fascinating that in the 1920s, when Duncan Phillips opened his home as America's first museum of modern art, he explained his project as, quote, an intimate museum combined with an experiment station. He was a remarkable person. He was a humanist. He was a liberal. He was an internationalist. He looked at the art object as a source of solace. He wrote extensively about risk-taking, social impact, encouragement of artists, creating a dynamic place for learning. What better founder could I be working for in his absence? It is our mission today, and we've actually formalized that. That is our mission statement. We are an intimate museum combined with an experiment station. It's our mission to actualize that rather incredible goal. We are an exceptional collection of modern and contemporary art in a dynamic environment for collaboration, innovation, engagement, scholarship, and new forms of public participation. To encounter the wonderful collection in that domestic, human-scaled, intimate setting of the rooms at the Phillips is hugely appealing. Everybody in my still brief, almost 3-year tenure goes, that gesture, I love the Phillips. I need to monetize that gesture. Visitors comment, and they use this word, on the authenticity of the experience. Our exhibitions and installations really remain true to that, the sense of quality and thoughtfulness. The voice of our curators and conservators, I feel, are really in harmony with what Phillips intended. And I think of humanities, human scale, I think, is a huge advantage for our institution. And we try to think about that very deeply. We craft our public intellectual persona through powerful partnerships with the University of Illinois. We have a new 3-year memo of understanding with GW. We have collaborations with UVA. Our new Center for the Study of Modern Art is led by a dynamic director-curator funded through the Mellon Foundation. It is the nexus for our conversations with artists, our dialogues with students, with faculty, with our postdocs, our membership, the public in general, interns, our professional staff. We mentor teachers throughout the DCPS, the district public school system, as well as in over a dozen communities across the country, forming a national community of learners that is sustained through coming together and through virtual conversations. Our partnership range from those university collaborations to programs with the Aspen Institute, the National Science Foundation's theaters, dance organ, grassroots community, et cetera, all as an effort to enhance our intellectual inquiry. Now, I've already set up a dilemma of the humanities in the public realm. The human scale, the intimacy, the authenticity of that experience in our galleries involves it's like slow cooking, slow looking, deep looking, a solitary contemplative experience. And yet, I've emphasized our public intellectual engagement. We want to be, we are open, accessible, impactful, vital in our community. The alone with others, is that really what I'm talking about here? But I tell you about this as a preface for our subject of exploring the humanities in a broader public forum, humanities outside the typical home of the Academy, the humanities in the wider world. Allow me to introduce our speakers in order as they're presented in the program. Robert Darnton, not from Princeton, the Carl H. Pforzheimer University professor and university librarian at Harvard University. And pitch hitting for Louise Dennis, who was sadly had a medical emergency this weekend. We have Peter Givler, the executive director of the Association for American University Presses, and Thomas F. Flynn, president of Alvernia University. Let us begin.
Thank you very much. Lots of people have the misfortune not to be from Princeton. I would like to thank Richard and Azar, and also, of course, the CIC, the SAIS, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful jam session about the humanities. I would also like to thank you for not inviting me to give a talk on the death of the book. I have been to so many conferences on the death of the book that I am convinced it's very much alive. One of the favorite jokes among publishers, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it goes like this. Question, what was the first book? Answer, the Bible. What was the second book? The death of the book. One of my favorite graffiti in the men's room in Princeton, if I may invoke Princeton again, is someone scrawled on the wall, you may have seen a similar one, "God is dead," signed Nitze. And then below it someone wrote, "Nitze is dead," signed God. The book is not dead. And in fact, I think if you consider the series of subjects connected with books and libraries and readers and writers, that you would find there is a great deal of misinformation. And in fact, what I'd like to do would be to survey some of what I would call the common misconceptions about this new world. You could, if you like, call them, they're things you hear every day, and you could call them proverbial non-wisdom. Non-wisdom or misconception number one. I'm going to go through 5, moving rather fast. That is, indeed, the book is dead. Not only is it wrong, we're supposed not to be statistical, but I do have a few statistics which I won't share with you. But there is a graph that goes up and up and up. It dipped a little bit in 2008 with the recession, but more books are produced each year in print than every previous year. The production worldwide of new titles in 2011 will be about 1 million. 1 million new titles. And in great reading societies, such as the United Kingdom, they have in the UK what they call Super Thursday. That was on October 1st last year, when 800 new titles were produced in a single day. Greater, I think, than the Super Bowl, but that's another subject. The books are just flourishing. They are flourishing especially in developing countries. China, I'm told, produced 35,000 new books last year. Brazil is exploding with new literary energy. So the world of books is actually very rich, populous. The population is not decreasing, it's increasing, and certainly books are not dead. Misconception number 2. We have entered the information age. Well, this announcement is usually intoned solemnly as if it were some new thing. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding because every age is an age of information, each in its own way, according to the media available at that particular time. Only a tiny fraction of our information is actually being made available to us, and that is misconception number 3. All information is available online. The absurdity of that claim is clear to anyone who has ever worked in archives. Only a tiny fraction of what knowledge has ever surfaced in the form of books has even been consulted by archival researchers. So there is a vast amount of, if you want to call it information, I'd call it potential knowledge, out there yet to be discovered. Google estimates that 129,864,880 different books actually exist in the world. Maybe that's right, I don't know. Google claims to have digitized 15 million of them, but that's only about 12%. And the gap between the digitized books and the books that exist is increasing every year because the production rate is 1 million annually. So how will the gap be closed? I don't think it will be, and I don't particularly think it's a good thing that it should be. Furthermore, a great deal of information in non-print formats is not available online. How are we ever going to archive and preserve everything that appears in blogs and tweets and handheld devices of all sorts? In fact, the most common means of communication, by word of mouth, which has always existed, goes completely unrecorded. It disappears into the air. So I think that's another fundamental misconception about the world in which we live. Misconception number 4. Libraries are obsolete. Everywhere in the country, librarians report that they have never had so many patrons. At Harvard, our reading rooms are crammed with students, but this is not an elite Ivy League phenomenon. If you go to the branch libraries of the New York Public Library system, you will see citizens everywhere, and they go for lots of purposes, sometimes for entertainment or cultural enrichment. Many of them are unemployed. You can't get information about job possibilities by reading the newspaper, because newspapers no longer carry much in the way of want ads. These ads appear online, and people go to the neighborhood library in order to get the information they need for employment, for seeking employment, and to get instruction about how even to use the computers in order to tune in to the online world. And of course, libraries do many things, including lots of instruction for K-12 schools, school children after school. I could go on and on. Librarians are reinventing themselves and developing new functions to guide readers through this jungle, which is cyberspace. There's so much garbage out there. There's so many dead ends and false leads that people need help in being able to get at the information they seek. Libraries were never warehouses of books, and they never will be, but what they are becoming increasingly, I think, are intellectual nerve centers that mobilize populations. And finally, another misconception: the future is digital. Well, yes, it is digital. That's not, I think, in itself wrong, but the statement is actually misleading. In 10 or 20 or 50 years, of course, the digital form of information will prevail. But the prevalence of electronic communication does not mean that printed material will cease to be important. In fact, research in this new discipline, which you could call the history of communication or the history of books, has demonstrated one central principle, namely that one means of communication does not displace another. So, of course, the radio did not kill the newspaper, and TV did not make the radio extinct, and computers did not destroy TV. What happens is a general enrichment and expansion of the ecology of communication. So I think you could say we are indeed in a phase of transition to an increasingly digital world, but that doesn't mean at all that the world in which we now live, and for which we feel rather familiar, will be simply obliterated by online material. So what I'm arguing against is a tendency to over-dramatize the situation in which we find ourselves, to see things as an either-or proposition, or black or white. In fact, I think that our common concern about the decline of respect for the humanities should not be interpreted or put in the context of technological change. It seems to me that the technological change is empowering rather than limiting. So I would like to attempt a counter-argument in order to undermine some of these popular misconceptions by discussing very briefly three subjects that I'm sure are familiar to you: the nature of books, the nature of reading, and the nature of writing. How have all of these things changed as a result of the new technology. Well, I think, it would be a mistake to imagine that old books, the good old printed codex, and new books, the electronic text bristling with hyperlinks, to imagine that they occupy opposite and inimical positions on some kind of technological spectrum. I think, in fact, that rather than being enemies, they are allies, and that we need to think of ways to make this alliance work for the public good. Last year, the sales of e-books in the trade sector, as you may have heard, increased so that it reached a level of 10%. So a lot of people are reading books in handheld devices of all sorts. And the prognostics for this year is that that proportion will increase to 15 or maybe 20%. So there's no question but that e-books and reading on handheld devices is spreading in this country. What's interesting is there's solid information that the people who buy these e-books frequently go out and buy printed books as well, and they buy them in larger quantities. In fact, there has been an increase in trade sales of printed books too. So it's not a zero-sum game. And it seems to me that successful publishers succeed by virtue of expanding the market, not by cornering it. Secondly, another example of what I see as an alliance between the e-book and the old book is the espresso book machine. I have no stock in this company, but I think it's a terrific idea. And many of you have probably seen it at work. You go into a bookshop, you go to a computer, you order an electronic text which arrives instantaneously. You have it printed out on sheets of paper which are trimmed. A paperback cover in color often is attached to it, all within 4 minutes, and frequently for less than $10. So the technology, which is electronic, is being married to a printing technology and is giving new life through print-on-demand books. So in general, I think we should imagine a more complex world in which these forces are working together and are mutually supportive. Second point, moving real fast, has to do with reading. Now, I think Neil Rudenstine was right to begin our discussions with an emphasis on the importance of slow reading. When I was an undergraduate, speed reading courses were just taking hold, and one of the English professors, Ben Brower, made a passionate intervention in favor of slow reading. Reading in which you would pause over things and reflect, and not rush through a text. Reading that would take the reader from one cover to another. So I'm not disputing that at all, but I would bring your attention to the fact that this kind of deep reading has never prevailed. In fact, there's some very interesting research on the way humanists read in the 16th century. I think Montaigne, which you invoked, Tony, is a good example. They didn't read books from one cover to the other. In fact, often they read for snippets, not that they called them that. And why? Well, the research of people like Lisa Jardine and Kevin Sharp and Tony Grafton have shown that these humanists were looking for ammunition which they could give their patrons to shoot off in political and rhetorical debates in courts. So a lot of commonplacing and reading and so on was very different in this past, which we imagine in some kind of romantic way as distinct from the reading of snippets today. There is a debate among book historians called the reading revolution. It's believed that at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, there was a revolutionary shift from what is called intensive reading to extensive reading. This is an idea that was developed by a fine German historian called Rolf Engelsing, And there's a lot to it, but I think it's fundamentally flawed. The basic argument was that before the late 18th century, most people who had books at all would have one book, the Bible, maybe the Pilgrim's Progress. They would read it over and over and over again in an intensive fashion. Then there developed things like the Gentleman's Magazine, Spectator, The Rambler. People began reading lots of different things, even newspapers, and reading them only once, then dashing off to the next thing. So you've got a kind of trivialization of the reading process. Well, I think this is wrong because this is also the era of Richardson, Rousseau, and Goethe. And we have lots of evidence that readers responded to these three great novelists with an intensity that was unimaginable earlier. So it's not as if there's a shift from the one to the other, but reading became more varied. There were lots of different kinds of reading that were developing just as the beginning of a mass public of readers developed. In other words, I think that it's crucial to imagine, again, this process of diversification and enrichment of an information ecology. This may sound awfully optimistic to you, but I'm myself a great believer in some of the arguments developed a long time ago now by Richard Hogarth, who's claiming, we were discussing popular culture earlier, who claimed that readers of popular literature didn't react in some passive way and just let their minds be brainwashed, but rather they read actively and integrated the message of those works into their own lives in their own way, according to their own working class culture. And an even more eloquent version of this argument is produced by Michel de Certeau, the French philosopher, who argued that reading was like poaching, especially among the working classes. The reader is a braconnier who takes what he wants from different things as he roams through the whole literary landscape and makes it into what he or she wants to make it. Again, not passively, but by integrating it into something that is meaningful to that person. I think that Edward Hirsch quoted someone, I failed to pick up who it was, Edward, who said, "Reading is complicity in the creative process." I think this is true for ordinary readers, normal citizens, people who are not sophisticates, but who want to make sense in life and even derive some pleasure out of reading. Or there was a discussion of Auden's 1939, which appealed to ordinary people in Chicago at a time when the need for meaning was very powerful after September 11th. Adventures in Reading in rural Colorado, I think, illustrates the same thing. We have a tendency, I believe, to condescend toward ordinary readers. Ordinary readers are perfectly intelligent. They may not be as sophisticated as some professors in elite schools, but we've just been warned about the difficulty of speaking only to ourselves and not using language that could be understood by cats and dogs. Not that ordinary readers are cats and dogs. Final point about writing. If I may draw on my own experience, I recently published a book about street songs in Paris in the middle of the 18th century. Now, at that time, songs operated in a semi-literate society basically as newspapers. And newspapers weren't yet available in Paris. Everything is censored. And so what happened is that people improvised new words to old tunes. And I've been through lots of collections of these improvised songs in the archives, and I found that the output of them is simply amazing. Again, statistics, but I can prove statistically that you've got about one new song every 3 days in Paris around 1750. Well, at that time, actually in April 1749, the government fell. All contemporary sources agree as to its cause. One word, chanson. Songs. Now, it was a little more complicated than that, but there was a particular song that forced the fall of the government for various reasons. France was, according to a witticism by Chamfort, an absolute monarchy tempered by songs. Songs mattered, but how did they matter? Well, partly because of the music. So I was able to go to a section in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France where you can look up a tune, because they all just say, sung to the tune of the crutch of Father Baraba. No one's ever heard of that tune today, but you look it up and then you get the musical annotation. Well, a friend of mine, Hélène Delaveau, is a cabaret singer in Paris, and she's recorded these songs, the one that brought down the government and a whole series of others surrounding it. They are available free online. So the book is a conventional book printed by the Harvard University Press, but at the back you've got the texts of the songs in my translation, in the original French, and then you tune in to the online version and you can hear them. This is a way of hearing the past, of capturing the past through sound. Now, this wasn't possible before the internet. What the new technology is doing for authors, for writing, is opening up new possibilities. So again, I feel that the old-fashioned book and the new-fashioned means of communication are mutually supportive and are opening the way to all kinds of exciting new possibilities. Now, this may sound Pollyannish or Panglossish, or, well, Polonius is another character who's been cited. I don't want to seem starry-eyed and optimistic. In fact, I think we are in trouble for other quite concrete institutional and economic problems of the sort mentioned earlier. So I would like to close on a down note by not singing, but by citing one example of the sorts of forces with which I think we must contend in the world of books and scholarship. And I'm sure you're familiar with it, but I'll move real fast just to remind you. It's a vicious circle. The price of serials, periodicals in the sciences has gone up and up and up at an amazing rate, much greater than the consumer price index. The cost of 1 year subscription to the journal called Tetrahedron is $39,082. $39,082 for one subscription to one journal. You could publish 400 monographs in the Humanities for that price. But we can't unsubscribe to Tetrahedron or other journals, we in research libraries, because the faculty demands access to this constant flow of new knowledge, especially in fields like the medical sciences. So how do we respond? We buy all the periodicals, our budgets go up and up and up, and we buy fewer monographs. Not, I'm happy to say, in Harvard, but in most research libraries, and that means that the balance, which used to be roughly 50-50 between periodicals and monographs, in some places is roughly 80-20, and some libraries have ceased buying monographs at all. The result, university presses can't print them. There has been a significant drop in the production of scholarly monographs on the part of university presses. They shifted to other things, such as a lot of books about birds. There are many, well, I could go on and on, but so-called mid-list books where university presses feel they can prevent themselves from sinking into the red. What happens when university presses produce fewer books? Young PhDs can't get their dissertations published. And so there's a ripple effect that I think harms the whole world of scholarship. What are we doing about it? Not much. Not much at all. This is an example of just some of the realities in the world of books and publishing and scholarship that I think need to be addressed. Well, the other economic and institutional realities of academic life are also urgent. I could go on and on discussing them. There's a lot to be said. But I suggest that we worry less about the technological implications of things and more about the if you like, a political aspect to them, so that we can actually get on with things and not simply wring our hands and lament the coming of this so-called information age. You may disagree, but I think I should stop at this point in order to leave room for the discussion. Thank you.
Is it going to work?
It'll work.
Okay.
Thank you, and I apologize right off the bat for walking off. It was nothing you said, Bob, but I'm getting over a cold, and I took the medication that I took a couple of hours ago didn't do the job it was supposed to, so I am here armed with lots of stuff to drink to try to keep the scratches out of my throat. I also would like to thank Rich and Azar for inviting me to talk to you today. When Rich and I talked, when was that? Sunday? I think Sunday afternoon about this session. He told me that it was the last session of the day, late afternoon. Probably everybody's going to be falling asleep. You should start off with a couple of jokes. So I said, terrific. I got a great joke about a couple of historians sitting at a bar, and one of them turns to the other and says, and Rich says, and by the way, we're going to webcast the whole day. And I said, Rich, that's a wonderful idea. And on second thought, maybe that joke isn't so funny. Anyway, here I am. Thank you for having me. I'm the executive director of the Association of American University Presses. And I'd just like to say a few words about AAUP and then go on to what I really want to talk about today. The association is, as you know, an association of university presses, scholarly publishers, nonprofit scholarly publishers. Most of the books that they publish, about 10,000 a year roughly, it varies between 10 and 11,000. Most of those books are in the social sciences and the humanities. That is, the scholarly books. As Professor Darnton has pointed out, university presses have had to find other sources of revenue, other kinds of books to publish, and I think we're doing a good job of sort of still publishing for the well-educated lay audiences in addition to publishing scholarship. But publishing scholarly books is still, that is, the results of postdoc research in the social sciences and humanities is still the bulk of what they do, a very large proportion of it. And it's going okay. Publishers have figured out, especially nonprofit publishers operating on very thin margins, hard times is nothing new. They figured out strategies for coping with it. And I just found out that the sales for the last fiscal year, we collect these statistics, they come out a little bit late. So the last fiscal year would be the one that ended last June 30th. But those sales were up around 630 million, and that's an improvement over the previous year, despite the hard times. Things are going okay. We're doing all right. As Professor Darnton also pointed out, there is the vast majority of books that are published in the world these days are books, as we understand them, P-books, not e-books. And that is, very simple reason for that. At this point, most of the revenue for publishing still comes from the sale of print books. E-book sales are growing rapidly, but the prices tend to be much lower, as you know, and it's just a little uncertain how those economics are going to work out. So, and when I say the majority of revenue comes from the sale of print books, I mean on the order of 90 to 95%. For some commercial publishers, it's probably even higher than that. So, at any rate, that's AAUP in a nutshell. We also, though, although there are, say, the bulk of the publications are still in print, or are in print, period, there's also a great deal of experimentation going on with electronic forms of delivery. There are several platforms sort of competing with each other right now. There's a consortium of university presses, UPCC, which you may have read about recently. There's also Johns Hopkins has formed, well, UPCC, that is Johns Hopkins. There's also a JSTOR platform. Oxford University Press has opened up Oxford Scholarship online to other university presses and so on. So there are lots of, this is a very rapidly growing area. There will be more and more electronic publishing. And if you go on the AAUP website, there is we keep a kind of survey of the electronic publishing projects underway at university presses, and there are about 40 or 45 of them now. I can't remember. I could give you the link to that website, but unfortunately, we've just finished a website redesign, which is due to launch in a few days, and I don't know where it's located on the new website. But if you go in there and nose around, you'll find it. So that's AAUP, and I'd be happy to answer questions later if there are more specific things that you would like to discuss. In this context, what I really want to talk about is, for reasons of my own, the last few days when I was invited to come and talk to you today, I had been doing a lot of thinking personally about my relationship to publishing and how I got into this racket, and about the humanities, my personal relationship to the humanities. And I'd just like to talk a little bit about that. Both of my parents were artists. My father was a painter and a printmaker, and my mother was a pianist. And both of them discovered very early on in their artistic careers that they also needed a day job. So my father went into teaching at the local art school in Portland, Oregon. My mother got a job teaching choir at a private school just outside of Portland. So this might lead you to think that, being in this family of artists, that my brother and I growing up, that table conversation, dinner time, we would sit around and discuss Chopin, Cézanne, so on. No such thing. What I remember, my earliest memories of my parents talking at dinner, were talking basically faculty politics. If this sounds familiar. And the specific, the issues that got them most exercised, and that we talked an awful lot about, or I listened to them talk an awful lot about, were things like how those nice, sweet, lovable people on the board of trustees, who, when it came to support for the music program, for example, were really knuckle-dragging troglodytes. How do we convince them to put more money into the music program? How do we convince the trustees at the museum that the school needs to be better supported, and so on? So this is just all by way of saying that in my personal life, arguments about the difficulties of maintaining programs in the humanities, getting support for the humanities, have been going on for a long, long time. And I don't say this with any pride, but I think I'm probably one of the oldest people in this room. Well, a long time. I won't put a number on it. So this is the issue of the kind of lack of support. It's not lack of support. It's a question of the tension in kind of public priorities and budgeting priorities, the competition that humanities programs and humanists have to engage in order to get support for those programs and keep them going. That has been going on for a long time, and I don't think that it's ever going to change. This is a continuing battle. The terms may change, certainly, as they do, and I don't mean to make light of the current crisis that we're facing. But if it isn't this crisis, it'll be some other. That at least has been my experience, and we go on with it. And what that suggests to me, one thing that it suggests to me is that, of course, when you get into any of these sort of political struggles, whether they're within a department, whether it's in a municipal government, state government, federal government, whatever it is, you can never go it alone. You really have to build alliances, look for partnerships. And in that connection, something interesting happened this weekend. I was just spending a lot of time with my family. It was a big family gathering out on the West Coast. And I had an interesting conversation with my niece, Katie, who is teaching in the Oakland public schools, which, of course, the California budget is in terrible shape. And Katie works with children with special needs. That's her specific area of expertise, responsibility. And she was talking about the difficulty that the school had been having, and how they just got a grant from Target, from the Target Corporation. They wanted to rebuild the library. I shouldn't say rebuild, refurbish the library. And Target, as you may have seen on television, has been advertising that they are putting 1% of their profits into programs for education. So the school decided, all right, let's apply to Target and see what happens. They got word about 2 weeks ago that they were one of 5 finalists in the Oakland, that is, the school got the word that they were one of 5 finalists in the Oakland area. And the site visit, a team of 5 people from that sort of education experts that had been hired by Target, came out, talked to everybody in the school, talked to the other 5 applicants. This all happened in one day. And by 3 o'clock that afternoon, they got the call, Katie's school got the call that they had been given this award. And what the award means is that Target would put up the money to completely refurbish the library, new carpeting, new light fixtures, new bookcases, painted, the whole works. It gave them a budget of $20,000 to stock the library, buy some new books. And they said that on the day the new library opens, every child in this school will be given 7 free books. Now, for a strapped public school in Oakland, California, this is a wonderful, absolutely marvelous program. And it just started me thinking about support for the humanities, where to get it, where it comes from. I know you think about this a lot, but the idea of going to corporations for it, for some reason this really resonated with me. Professor Darnton was talking a few minutes ago about the terrible problems that that universities, especially research libraries, are facing, budget problems that they're facing, partly due to the increase in serials prices for STM journals and kind of the crunches that has created for all of us. I'm not going to mention any names. I'm sure Professor Darnton would be happy to supply them, and I can tell you later offline. But there are certain publishers that it's easy to blame for this problem. But what if we went to them with a proposal? You guys are making all this money. You can, maybe it would be interesting for you to support a kind of program for the humanities, put some of this money back into the community. You would get public relations benefit of doing it. Might take some of the stress off libraries or some other parts of the machine. It's just that when you're building alliances, I don't know where this would go, whether there's, whether it would work or not, but when you're building alliances, it's often most useful to do the most difficult thing, which is to find ways to work with the people on the other side of the aisle, as it were, the people with whom you disagree, the people whose values you think are inimical with yours. And this might be a little something. So that's one thing, just building support. The other thing I wanted to talk about was making it personal. Talking about the humanities, Dana Joya in the last session was talking about the the kind of data that's out there that can be used, and that's terrific. That's wonderful. That can be very effective in talking in meetings on the Hill, talking with Hill staffers and so on, and just even at other levels of government as well. But the subject of this particular session is trying to move it out to the academy and talk about outside other areas of support for the humanities. And it has been my experience, I think this has also been echoed by earlier speakers today, that there is tremendous support, not necessarily for scholarship in the humanities, but for the kind of activities that underlie the humanities, for literature, for music, for dance, for architecture, for all of the fields that humanists at the university level like to study. And if you can connect with the interests at that level, sometimes that can open doors, even on the Hill. John Vaughan, who isn't here today, the Association of American Universities, is fond of observing that in Washington, the plural of anecdote is data. Politicians love to hear stories, and they respond to those stories, and it's one of the fights that we have at many levels on the Hill, is that there are people who have more compelling stories to tell than we do. That they are able to make a case for special legislation to address their needs because they can tell a compelling story, a good story. So thinking about stories and how to tell those stories, and that really comes down to, in my mind, to connecting, sort of reestablishing in our own minds just what it was that drew us into this business in the first place. In publishing, one of the great cliches about people in publishing, well, there are two of them. One is that it's the accidental profession. Nobody ever is trained for it. The other is that, you'd ask people why they got into publishing, why they're doing it, and they'd say one version or another of, because I love books. Well, that's fine, that's great, but I think you need to push that a little bit further. Since we're talking about this and I brought it up, I'll make a confession about why I love books. It was because that's certainly true of me. It's what pushed me through graduate school into literary studies, comparative literature, and then on into publishing, and has been one of the major themes in my life, my whole adult life. Basically, when I was a young man in college, I was a sophomore in college, a book sort of saved my life. I was, as you know, a sophomore in college, an adolescent, deeply into all of the ills that go along with adolescence, hormones going crazy, filled with angst and dread and existential awe, and all the rest of it. Didn't know where I was going. Didn't really have any clear focus on anything. And I read Crime and Punishment. And something about that book, it was a number of years later before I really began to understand what it was, but something about that book really just kind of opened a door for me. And I now, looking back on it, can put it this way. This is still kind of crude, but I personally have never harbored a desire to murder a pawnbroker. But the Dostoevsky's ability to empathize with this young man, Raskolnikov, to create a character that was so compelling and with whom I could identify so deeply, gave me the idea, gave me the sense that because Dostoevsky, because a writer could do this, could get a focus on a young man, could understand a young man who was as deeply troubled in his own way, maybe more deeply troubled than I was, that maybe it was possible for me, through writing and through literature, to begin to get a grip on my own troubles. That didn't stop me from flunking out of college, I have to say. It took a while, but it was an important revelation, and it's kind of at the core of what I mean about why I love books. Finally, just to wrap up, another story about making things real, and this is also a story about my niece, Katie. We were at a large gathering on Saturday afternoon. Katie decided that in order to honor the life of her grandmother and my mother, she wanted to sing a song. So she did. There were about 80 or 90 of us there, and she ran through the song. It's very short, just 3 lines. Relax, I'm not going to sing it. It's a very short song. It's a round, 2 parts, and she sort of sang it in German, then sang it in English, then divided us up into 2 groups and got us to do it as a round. It was a nice way to end, and it's what I'm going to end with here. The round itself is just very simple. I'm not going to do the whole thing, just paraphrase it. All things will perish under the sun, only music endures. Thank you.
Well, we are at the end of the afternoon, and since I don't think they are likely to call attention to themselves, and Azar is already standing, I would like Richard and Azar to stand briefly and have us acknowledge them and thank them. Well, I'm not sure which is more daunting, to be the panelist assigned the task of addressing how higher education can revitalize the humanities, or as the final panelist to recognize that I had better not unduly delay the start of our post-symposium reception. You need not worry. As colleagues here know well, pronouncing confidently on behalf of others on important topics and knowing when to cease and desist are 2 skills essential to longevity in the university presidency. So let me offer just some brief reflections designed to help shape our final discussion. Understanding that I would follow distinguished speakers who would address the ideals and potential role of the humanities in academia and beyond, and intrigued by the question of this session concerning the engagement of the public with the humanities, I decided to focus on the life of the humanities as lived out in the sector of higher education in which I've spent my professional career. Moderately selective, small and mid-sized private institutions. By demographic profile, schools like my own, a Franciscan university on the edge of a racially diverse city, a city that is, by the way, about 85% people of color, a Franciscan university on the edge of a racially diverse city, educating 3,000 students of all backgrounds and ages, many from low-income families unfamiliar with higher education. Schools like this are representative of the general public, or at least that portion fortunate to have some college education. I might just mention that my student population is almost 40% Pell eligible, and in addition to the 3,000 degree-seeking students, we have 500 rather marvelous retired students who are in the seniors college. I've taught there for 5 years, and they take a series of mini courses that are designed specially for them, and trust me, they are the public. As context for my reflections, I asked all members of my university's humanities faculty to share thoughts on the symposium's themes. I also interviewed 2 groups of students, including some in my own current team-taught interdisciplinary honors seminar, Faith and Doubt in Modern Literature. In addition, I talked to a very eclectic sampling of first-year students, most of them majoring in professional programs like business, nursing, and occupational therapy. At schools like mine with substantial general education requirements, students have little sense of the humanities as a collective concept, but they have an active understanding of the humanities disciplines that comprise our general education program. philosophy and theology, as well as literature, language, and history. Whether humanities majors or not, students were drawn to our humanities courses because, in their own words, such courses helped me to see myself for the first time, to open my mind, to walk a mile in another's shoes. Humanities courses, several noted, pushed them far outside their comfort zone and encouraged creative, open-ended thinking rather than memorization and more passive learning. One non-major, while acknowledging he liked his intended major, announced rather proudly to a large group of first-year students that his first semester freshman year philosophy course had, in contrast to all of his other courses, had far greater personal significance because it had compelled him to re-examine all sorts of preconceived notions. Humanities courses, said one older student, made me absolutely squirm by posing uncomfortable questions and forcing me to question unexamined assumptions. Without prompting, students praised humanities courses as opportunities for dialogue and community building, in contrast to courses where learning the material seemed more a private matter between the instructor and student, or just between the student and his or herself. And as I pointed out to one lively group, they had praised humanities courses in the space of 10 minutes for apparently contradictory but really interconnected reasons. They had praised humanities courses both for prompting unprecedented deep self-reflection, but also challenging them to look beyond themselves to probe beliefs and cultures completely different than their own. Interestingly and soberingly, several students thought that even some of their best teachers were far too defensive about the value of required study of the humanities. At times, faculty teaching these courses appeared apologetic that such study took attention away from students' majors. As one student said, if they don't act like this is very important, there's no chance students will think so. My faculty members, not surprisingly, identify far more strongly with the humanities themselves, regardless of their disciplines, and emphasize the intrinsic value of such study cited by numerous speakers today. They are careful to distinguish between humanities education and liberal arts education, which they define as including math and science in particular. And naturally, being humanities faculty, they had all sorts of questioning about the assumptions of today's program. Some, in fact, saw the research university as fostering the same position of privilege for the sciences, amply funded by sponsored research, reflected in the prevailing societal preoccupation with scientific and technological progress. For them, the conception of the sciences as providing so-called objective, useful knowledge and the current preoccupation with measurement in the academy somewhat inevitably marginalized the humanities in their view as merely subjective, impractical, and therefore less important. In this context, as one of them said to great applause on the email, it is the university, not the humanities, that need revitalization, even redemption, a sentiment echoed, as we know, in recent critiques by Frank Donahoe and others. Many of my humanities faculty argued forcefully against the contemporary tendency to emphasize the practical application of humanities study, or more precisely, as some said earlier, that an instrumentalist approach, they argued, was in fact self-defeating, and as one colleague insisted, served only to cheapen the humanities. Claims that the humanities were invaluable in teaching communication skills or critical and creative thinking are foolhardy, noted one professor. Such skills can be fostered by other fields that appear to have and do have far greater practical use on the job market. Nor should the humanities be understood merely as part of the process of acquiring information, noted one colleague, as if education were like filling a car with gasoline or transferring a computer file. For him, developing the computer analogy, humanities education is about changing the hardware, not the software of one's computer. It is the pursuit of, quote, intellectual maturation, the structural change of the mind. In my view, this conception of the humanities leads us naturally to how the humanities might be more central in the life of the university and to our students. Needed first, in the words of one colleague, is an apologetics for the humanities that effectively asserts the importance of human development, the growth of humans as humans, more than as productive workers. While a compelling case for the humanities includes the development of essential skills, skill development should be viewed as an appealing byproduct of such study rather than a central purpose. From work 2 decades ago on the Association of American Colleges and Universities Transformational Cultural Legacies Project, I believe that humanities studies are an essential way students learn about the world's diverse societies and cultures, past and present, and the diversity of human experience, even if we no longer think this reducible to easily agreed upon syllabi and reading lists. Whether or not one prefers a historical approach to the humanities, it has never been more important than that today's students and citizens reflect on differing responses through the ages to the questions about the meaning of human nature, about goodness, about justice, and a free society. Such inquiry also has the power to help our students cultivate habits of the mind, habits of the heart, and habits of the soul. Even if universities like mine were filled with humanities majors, I would argue for a coherent general education program shaped around some intentional integrated student learning experiences. Random distribution requirements with little apparent purpose or shape serve, even if unintentionally, to marginalize the humanities. Small wonder in this all too common situation that faculty, like students, see humanities courses as inconvenient hurdles to get out of the way or to defer as long as humanly possible. In contrast, colleges that make humanities studies important in the first-year experience and design shared integrated learning opportunities for their students send a powerful, impossible-to-miss message about the purpose of college. Over 2 decades ago, at my first college of employment, a group of young, almost entirely untenured faculty led a radical redesign of general education that made humanities studies central to all students' experience through paired or interdisciplinary offerings sequenced in a way that mirrored the developmental learning occurring in most majors. Disparaged by a senior science faculty member as the humanities mafia, all of us, even today, 25 years later, consider that designation our proudest badge of honor. There are, of course, countless ways within higher education to highlight the humanities. Let me suggest a few from my current experience. Certainly cross-disciplinary courses, especially ones supplemented by community-based learning experience, directly connect the humanities to the world around them. And when those courses are connected to the faculty member's scholarship, something really magical happens. I have a senior biologist and a senior theologian who have taught a series of courses that have turned into 2 books. The first book on the biogene controversy was called God, Science, and Design of Genes. These started as courses. These have now become very well popular books. They're now writing a book on Darwin, and they recently gave a presentation, I might say, to a standing room only crowd, not only of students, but of people from all across our county. And it was an extraordinary event. At Catholic universities like my own, the study of philosophy is celebrated and required, along with work in theological or religious studies, including at least one course in ethics. At my university, for example, besides the usual undergraduate requirements, all 800 plus of our graduate students take not 1 but 2 courses in ethics, one taught by a trained ethicist and the other an applied course appropriately in the student's field of study. Interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, this emphasis on ethics and value-based humanistic reflection is cited frequently by employers as part of the Alvernia advantage. In an area with a famous jazz fest and with several colleges and universities far more well known than we are in the fine arts, Alvernia established both a literary festival and a lecture series entitled Ethics, Leadership in the Community. Acclaimed historians and nonfiction writers, as well as famous novelists like Richard Russo, or scholars gathered from across the globe last fall to celebrate local son John Updike, convey by their presence on campus and in our community the simple truth that such work really matters. Equally impressive is the Campus Writers Series, initiated by a young first-year faculty member, himself a professional writer. 6 years later, it draws crowds together periodically, a large, diverse, eclectic collection of students, faculty, and staff writers. Our university lecture series, with its focus on the ethical dimension of contemporary, usually controversial issues, fills a void in a small metropolitan community and has attracted to campus a wide-ranging sampling of the general public. I remember a lecture 3 years ago entitled Race, What It Is and What It Is Not, by a leading Latino scholar. We had a standing room only crowd, members of the Latino community that had never been not only on our campus but almost on any college campus around. Such programs, with their refusal to settle for easy answers, serve to heighten the university's identification as a safe space for sometimes difficult dialogues, and has made us a center for interfaith programs and intercultural dialogue. They also underscore the essential, fundamental nature of the humanities. And I thought I'd conclude with two responses from colleagues to my inquiries about the nature of this symposium. One is a senior philosophy colleague, not knowing my own teaching style, who insisted that given the subject matter, the method of teaching the humanities should always be Socratic, in his words, asking questions and questioning answers. Reading this recalled a brief essay written as a young ABD professor in my second year of full-time teaching. Liberal arts education, I said boldly, should cultivate in students the habits of constructive skepticism, by which I meant a process of relentless questioning that would help clarify values and what they considered sacred. Last week, from a complementary perspective, my initial department chair, who hired me out of graduate school more years ago than I choose to reveal, my initial department chair and teaching mentor, an exemplar of humanistic study and the values of passionate, respectable secular humanism, provided a fitting, if unsettling, coda for my reflections today. The humanities seek to minister to students with restless hearts and inquiring minds. We don't seek to remedy that condition in our graduates, but to deepen it through knowledge and reflection. We need to turn out more such citizens for our increasingly dysfunctional democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert, Peter, and Thomas. I know that Richard and Azar are very eager to pull together our thoughts and make a few comments. So I want to suggest, if I may, that we save our questions for this panel for the reception that's going to happen right afterwards. Is that? Oh, no, there's dissension between the two leaders. 2 minutes? 2 questions. Okay. I agree. That's what I get for following orders. No, that's all right. Is there a question? Yes.
I'm Julie Goldsmith from the Ohio Humanities Council. You so well articulated the importance of the meaning of a book on oneself. How should state councils define their relevancy when we know the relevancy of a book on an individual? The councils are conduits between scholars and the public, just as university presses are conduits between scholars and the academy.
Well, I want to actually defer to Thomas, because you were talking about how one book could be so profoundly influential in changing a life. So, no, sorry, it was Peter reading Dostoevsky. Raskolnikov is not Holden Caulfield, but...
Good question, which means I guess I don't really have an answer. I think it's to me, it's a question, what I was trying to get at with that with that example. I think it's just a question of trying to find a way, and this may have to do more with sort of one-on-one conversations, of just getting down to whatever the nub of whatever it was that drew you into this wacky business in the first place. Why do you like books? Why do you think they're important? And if you can tell that story, and I certainly didn't do it in any very compelling way, but if you can find a compelling way to tell that story, people do respond to it. It's like people do respond, I think.
Is there another question? Over here on this side.
Jonathan Green, Sweetbriar College. There were a couple of themes that I think have come up throughout the entire day that I think tie back to your comments about the curriculum, but of which I was reminded by your song. There was a fellow named Walter Russell who, one of his surviving quotes was, "All passes, art alone endures." But Russell's career was spent as the leader of an organization called the Twilight Club. That a number of leaders in late 19th and early 20th century industry were trying to find ways to unify their appreciation of the arts and the sciences in a single pursuit. And it went down some strange paths over the course of time. But one of the things that we've seen certainly in the past few generations, we look back to Aristotle, we've got the politics and poetics. We look at Goethe, we have poetry, drama, and natural science. And really throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, that we didn't have that that bifurcation between these various themes. And Doug talked about how the new humanities are what we now think of as the social sciences. But what the humanities really provide to all of us as we advocate for ourselves and as we look at our curriculum as the unifying, it's the web that ties all of the things that are important to us together. And if we're going to be advocating for the humanities as a group of informed peoples who for a long time represented a minority, as the academy has expanded and become the entire human population, where we the people was 25% of the people when it was written, that as we do that, the ways that we can advocate and draw the importance, I think, to the broader public of the value that the humanities have is by finding every way that we can to demonstrate how, in fact, it is the fabric that ties these various important points together.
Richard, Azar? I think that Richard and Azar wanted to have time for their comments, so I thank the panel and thank all of you.
Yes, I do. Good. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, and I want to be very quick to assure you that we are not going to attempt to summarize everything that's been said today, nor are we going to announce a new initiative from CIC or SAIS or anyone else, but rather I think there's lots to think about from today and lots of directions in which we can go as individuals and as institutions, and I hope that you will continue the conversations begun here. You may have noticed in your folders that there is a list of participants in this symposium, including email addresses, and I hope that the conversations begin here will continue with old friends and new friends in the days ahead. The webcast, as I said earlier, will be posted on both the SAIS and the CIC websites, so you'll have access to that going forward. And we will collect and post or publish in some form as many of the presenters' remarks as the presenters are willing to give us in a reasonably coherent form in the next weeks. And we do expect a print publication. There are a lot of people to thank. First, I want to salute my co-conspirator, Azar Nafisi, for her wonderful cooperation as we worked together over the year plus in which this has been in the making. Thank you, Azar. And her colleagues, Layla Austin and Christine Kunkel, have been just wonderful to work with. A number of CIC staff colleagues have been instrumental in this event as well. Barbara Hedrick, our Vice President, and Sharita Jackson and Allison Blackburn of our conferences staff, and Laura Wilcox and Lilia Legess of our communications staff, and my assistant Laura Tercy and Christoph Kunkel, our operations vice president. But most of the thanks go to our speakers and moderators. You have given us just so much to think about. We are so grateful to you for what you have given us today. And thanks to all of you for being with us today. Before I turn the microphone over to Azar for a few brief comments, and then we can all go to the reception and eat and drink and be merry, I do want to acknowledge that I think it's a result of today, Azar, that rally on the National Mall is not so far off. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
So much, and Richard, you are a miracle worker, and I very much, I want to have you go there and enjoy yourself. But one point that I wanted to say is that coming where I'm coming from, I'm always wrought with anxiety. Every time that something goes well, I think, oh my God, what is going to go wrong next? And as I was listening to all of you, I was thinking that, well, if anybody else was here from outside, from those policymakers and funders and all the people we were thinking about, they would say, there's nothing wrong with humanities. These people are thriving, they are cohesive, they are even funny, they're subversive of themselves, and in fact, they thrive on crisis. Because the whole world, including this country, including those businessmen who are not supporting us, and those policymakers that we need to convince to support us, they're all in serious crisis. But crisis, doubt, questioning, what you called, the Socratic way of looking at the world, demands crisis. So we are in absolutely wonderful shape, and thank you for 6 hours of sitting here, not looking at one's watch, not thinking of walking the dog, not thinking of what is for dinner, just thinking that there should be more questions and more questions. Thank you. I just want to thank everyone, Richard, CIC, Barbara, all the conspiracies we went through from Santa Fe to Washington, and now here, and also the wonderful people at SAIS, Amir, Pasic, and his development and alumni relation team, Ashley Rogers, Mary Evans, Michael Roberts, Kerry Hunter, Jordi Izzard, Christine, of course, again, she's been wonderful, Felisa Kloops and her communication team, Sonita Mantarovic, Chris Hunter, and Sarah Lerner. Since every single speaker, from the first panel to the end, talked about our interlocutors, our readers, the ones with whom we share curiosity and sympathy, I really hope that we will start the march from the Jefferson Memorial, come to the Lincoln Memorial, fill out the Lincoln Memorial with all the people who are our allies, bookstore owners, librarians, the 3 endowments, democracy included, and performance artists, writers, and our readers, which basically means the whole of America. Fill out the Lincoln Centers throughout the Smithsonian, which is the pride and joy of this city, right up to the Capitol, to remind people that the founders, despite all their flaws, had something that was very important to remember today, that they always identified America with enlightenment and with humanism. And I think that this is a good time to remember that. Thank you so much. See you in Washington on the Mall.